All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome so much to the Offices of the Special Competitive Studies Project. We're delighted to have all of you here today. For those of you who may be new to us, SCSP is a bipartisan, not-for-profit initiative with a clear mission: to strengthen Americans' long-term competitiveness as artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies are reshaping our national security, economy, and society. We want to ensure that America is positioned and organized to win the techno-economic competition between now and 2030, the critical window for shaping the future. It is in this spirit that we are honored to host today's discussion. We're very pleased to welcome Jamie Morgan from the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology. Jamie has recently authored a timely and important report on how the United States can modernize its defense export system. Her work highlights how accessible, dual-use, and commercial technologies can help smaller militaries offset China's advantages, as recent case studies already suggest. In order to leverage these technologies, we need to urgently reform our defense export system with its opaque, outdated licensing requirements, bias towards costly programs of record, and systematic delays that push partners towards foreign suppliers. Jamie proposes an innovation-first model that equips allies directly with adaptable, commercially derived tools and reforms exports by democratizing direct commercial sales, creating structured government-to-government pathways for non-program of record technology, and building an export infrastructure and culture oriented to innovation. Implemented together, these changes would enable partner-led deterrence, reduce escalation risks and U.S. burdens, and better align U.S. influence with the realities of today's defense innovation landscape. Implementing these types of reforms would strengthen America's strategic position and help to counteract China's growing military power. We look forward to a thoughtful and engaging conversation on this important topic. Finally, I want to put in a short plug for our own report, OffsetX Evolved. This new defense report builds upon the original OffsetX framework, revisiting its core recommendations in light of accelerating technological change and the shifting global security landscape. We hope you will read both of these urgent reports, share your perspectives, and join us in advancing this critical conversation about America's future security and competitiveness. Thank you so much for all joining today.
Thank you, James. And thank you all for being here today. My name's Harry Kresa. I'm the Director of Studies at the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, and I'll be your moderator today. We are indeed very grateful for SCSP hosting us here today for this timely and important discussion, and for all of you taking the time to join us today for that discussion. I wanted to kick off real quick with a round of introductions from what I think is just the perfect panel to discuss these issues here today.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Morgan, a non-resident fellow with Carnegie Mellon's Institute for Strategy and Technology. And thank you all so much for being here today. Many people here have been thought partners in this important project and excited to get it out into the world and work with you on next steps.
Howdy, I'm Chris Ocha. I'm the staff director for Chairman Risch on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As most of you no doubt aware, a lot of these issues flow through the committee in its approval process. So happy to be part of the conversation here.
Hey everyone, I'm Natasha Ahmed. I come from a private equity background. I'm a defense tech investor. I'm a commissioner on Loudoun's Economic Development Advisory Commission. I sit on the board of Space Force Association, Washington, D.C. I'm also an advisor to Trends, an Emirati think tank that is doing AI bridge building work here in D.C. So excited to be a part of this and give you my insight as a defense tech investor.
Perfect. And I'm James Reisoff. I'm a director for defense here at the Special Competitive Studies Project. I started my career as a software engineer in the private sector and then shifted over to the RAND Corporation as a senior technical analyst, working on all things sort of software, AI, and defense related.
So we're going to start our conversation today talking a bit about the problems that we're facing here. What are the challenges that we're hoping that many of these emerging technologies can help us begin to address and empower our allies and partners around the world, but in particular the Indo-Pacific, to boost their deterrent capabilities. And Jamie, we're here today because you have launched this really tremendous new publication on that very topic. Tell us a bit about those challenges that we're facing and how they are shaping the strategic environment as we know today with such urgency.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to James and SCSP for having us. It's great to be collaborating on this project. So there are three challenges that really frame this project that we wanted to highlight and draw out. And for me, in many ways, they brought together insights over 17 years of working in Congress and the Department of Defense, both on arms sales to allies and partners in Asia and with defense technology leaders at DoD. So the first challenge is a recognition that the US approach to gray zone deterrence in Asia is failing. The US government with allies and partners have been enormously effective at deterring high-end conflict with China, between the United States and China. But if you look at both the number of incidents of PRC harassment of allies and partners across the region and the intensity, it's been going up significantly in the past few years. And so we wanted to look at another way to get after deterrence in the gray zone. The second recognition, which I think is something important to all of us here, is a number of different changes in the technology landscape in warfare and how that's transforming the battlefield, but in particular, the proliferation of commercially available technologies that are often not available to US allies and partners because of barriers in what we're calling the defense export system, which includes direct commercial sales and foreign military sales. And looking forward to getting into that. I think our goal on that challenge is to build on a lot of the enormously good work that's been done on FMS reform broadly and focus particularly on the story and challenges for innovative tech or non-programs of record. And then the third challenge is a recognition that the defense innovation landscape globally is changing, that the United States is no longer the only leader or source of innovative commercial technologies that can be used for defense purposes. Ukraine is now a massive producer of unmanned systems and exporting it, but you also have governments across Asia and in Europe investing in their own defense tech accelerators, putting more money into defense. And so that also demands a new approach for the United States government, we think, to defense exports if it wants to maintain both strategic influence as well as market share. So those are the factors that we look at coming into this report, looking forward to getting into the barriers and more of it. But I think the final point I'll make is that it's been very interesting as we've built this initiative, talking to folks about how much energy we think there potentially is to raise and elevate this conversation now. I think coming out of defense acquisition reform this year, both on the Hill and in the executive branch, and the potential to leverage that momentum towards what Jessica Lewis is here today is called the second valley of death for the defense startups, which is in defense exports. So looking forward to talking more.
Great, thank you, Jamie. Chris, to that end, you've worked on this issue set for years for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Can you tell us a bit about where we are in the defense export reform story from the legislative perspective and what kinds of challenges the Senate sees between here and that world we're trying to create?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to first kind of step back and set the context a little bit better. First and foremost, foreign military sales is supposed to be an outpouring of U.S. foreign policy. And I think one of the disconnects that comes right off the bat is everyone thinks this is a Department of Defense activity, very often forgetting first the role of the State Department, but then second also of the Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee in the process. And while there is an enormous desire to improve the process, to speed it up, more importantly, to make it move at the speed of relevance, I think there's been a massive disconnect about talking to the important stakeholders that are part of this. And you see that continue to bear out on the Hill when it comes to the conversations about how we reform FMS, DCS, as well as other types of security cooperation that are important and necessary to move forward. AUKUS was a prime example of this. If we couldn't get it right with our closest partners, the UK and Australia, how are we going to get this right in a much broader context with a lot more allies, a lot more partners that also we need to work with in this space. And I think it just highlights the challenge. The US government, the executive branch, specifically the bureaucracy, is not comfortable with risk. and that slows everything down. We saw this with AUKUS, a desire, even when Congress mandated improving the ETL, the Accepted Technologies List, even things that we specifically said were supposed to be on the list, the bureaucracy wanted to say, no, 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 it can't be on the list. And if you deal with that with exquisite systems going to our most trusted allies, when we get to the issues of how do we do AI or other technologies that are moving very, very rapidly, the baseline is to just stay no. And that is not an environment that we can live in anymore. As mentioned, the gray zone, especially competition with China, if we cannot get this risk calculus properly established with inside the bureaucracy and in broader government, this is going to be a very, very substantial challenge to FMS reform and some of the other things that we hope to accomplish. So there's a lot of mood on the Hill to continue to move in the right direction, but we're going to need to see a flow of information, especially from the Department of Defense to the Foreign Relations Committees, to be able to have a much more and rapid analysis and sign-off in this going in the right direction. Also, State Department has to understand its role a little bit better and its engagement with the department and with the committees to be able to facilitate that as well. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but there are a lot of impediments to moving quickly in terms of legislative reforms that help address many of these issues.
Very well put. I think the next part of this conversation, of course, is what's the upside risk? What is the opportunity that's not being realized here because of this downside risk aversion in the bureaucracy? You know, James, actually, I'd like to hop to you here as a scene setter first. You've studied these issues for SCSP and at RAND. You've explored the role of like private sector innovation in particular contingencies, including the Taiwan Strait crisis. What are some of the technologies that really best elucidate these dynamics here that we want to be able to see make its way through this defense export process and shape the strategic environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if you look specifically at the Taiwan Strait crisis, there's a few technologies that are really going to be key here, right? So first off, there's only a couple of ways you can actually get meaningful numbers of troops across the strait if you want to actually threaten an invasion or succeed in an invasion. So you can basically transport people by large body aircraft, you can transport by helicopter, or you can transport by ship, right? Large body aircraft tend to be really vulnerable. So the Russians at Hostomel, for example, were unable to reinforce their airhead, despite the fact that the Russian Air Force, in theory, should have had pretty substantial air superiority there. And so that's a scenario that most of the military analysts I know are a little less worried about just due to the vulnerability of those systems. So that basically leaves two, right? So helicopters and ships, right? So technologies that are going to be able to counter both of those things. So we've seen a lot of advances in Ukraine with sort of unmanned interceptors of various types. Those have a real potential at a very cost-effective level to essentially nullify the possibility of an air assault across the Taiwan Strait, right? So that's a potentially game-changing technology. And then two would be advanced mines or even dumb mines deployed by unmanned vessels, right? So the Ukrainians have done a lot to take back control of the Black Sea using unmanned equipment. And essentially, mines are really, really annoying for pretty much every navy in the world. So the more that you can do to get mines in the right places to disrupt an invasion fleet, that could be a real game changer on the sea path. So those are the direct combat sides, right? I think when we look a little bit beyond that, having sufficient early warning, so we saw how game-changing it was for the Ukrainians to have meaningful warning before the Russians were coming for a real large-scale invasion and how much could be rushed to their aid. So that could be a potentially game-changing advance for anything going on in Asia, right? It gives you time to marshal resources, to push reinforcements and munitions into the theater. So the more predictive analytics we can have that sees that this isn't just an exercise, this isn't just a small thing, the big one is coming, right? The more warning we can get of that, the better off we will all be. And so a lot of that involves around AI and data collection and having the right kinds of data to tell you, sort of differentiate routine operations from not, normal operations. And then I think we're all seeing in Ukraine this worry that we are going to be in wars of attrition of unmanned systems, right? Like we have seen massive quantities of machines being lost in the Ukraine theater, and that will likely, it won't be quadcopters, right? Like there are parts of the geography of the theater that will be meaningfully different. But the worry I think we have there is China's been the factory to the world. I mean, China basically supplied both sides of the Ukraine war with unmanned equipment for large portions of the first 2 years of that fight, right? And so what's going to happen when everybody else in the world is going up against that factory, right? So I think that's something that a lot of us are really concerned about, and that's sort of, it reinforces the need to be working with all, you know, if I want to fight a war in the Indo-Pacific, I want Toyota, right? I want the chaebols of Korea. There's a lot of people in that region that can manufacture a lot of stuff, and so that makes this topic even more important.
Absolutely. The prospect of how to plan for and procure the tools for a crisis when you are potentially going to use those tools on the person who made them for you is a very complex set of questions there. As a quick follow-up, James, are there areas where you see there's particular risk of Chinese leap ahead potential that would like really complicate our strategic thinking here?
Yeah, so a couple that I think we would call, so we at SCSP just recently released a report where we sort of identify three critical technologies that are sort of self-reinforcing, right? So there's data collected by sensors of all types, sort of both space-based but also terrestrial-based. So data brings what we call information advantage, right? The ability to sort of know a lot more than your enemy or than your adversary and be prepared to make better decisions. Then there's the need to create decision advantage through tools like AI and advanced analytics, right? So being able to recognize, so to have more decisions that could be made, but also to make better decisions in the critical locations, right? And then finally, there's what we call lethality advantage that's delivered through autonomy, right? So that's both autonomous equipment, but it can also be the automation of business processes and other things, right? So in all three of those areas, I think we should be very concerned that China has the ability to outpace the United States, right? So China has a ton of data collection capability. They collect all kinds of information about their own people and have a lot of experience sort of merging large data sets to do things like track American intelligence into operatives, right? So that's a real area of concern. So on the automation side, as I said, you know, China is the factory to the world. China makes more drones and unmanned equipment than anybody else, excepting possibly Ukraine after many years of war and preparation, right? And so in a world where DJI is like manufacturing almost all the drones that we see in American stores and worldwide, it should be a real concern to us that China has the ability to more quickly and more, you know, to scale up manufacturing and sustain manufacturing of these technologies much longer than any individual competitor or potentially even all of its competitors simultaneously. And then finally, the United States is certainly, in my opinion, leading in AI in terms of developing algorithms, but something that we're keeping an eye on here at SCSP is who's really adopting algorithms more quickly, right? So just because OpenAI can make the best model doesn't mean that American businesses will necessarily be the ones that adopt AI more quickly than their counterparts, right? And so something in particular I'm a little worried about is I think what we saw with DeepSeek was the ability for China to lower the cost of their models, and that could potentially be decisive in terms of adoption. I think the US tech community has actually been a little too oriented at like trying to advance the state of the art and sort of buying lots of compute and throwing lots of talent and compute at the problem. But they're not doing so in a way that's necessarily cost effective. I mean, we see OpenAI and these other firms burning through billions of dollars, right? With I think OpenAI was projected to lose something like $80 billion over the next 4 years, right? Like, I'm worried that people like DeepSeek and other Chinese competitors are going to get to profitability much faster than we are, and to be able to essentially fast follow on the best in breed models, so that essentially they're able to deliver adoption in a way that like the US may pave the way for the technology, but they may be the ones who reap the real benefits.
That's sufficiently bracing. Jamie, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on that point. I think a key thing that we found that's really interesting in both like recent examples in warfare and in like the historical literature on this is the two factors that are most determinative in letting a kind of David challenge its Goliath, if you will, or a less advanced military when you're facing that type of decision information advantage are getting access to innovative technologies and then using it to develop new operational concepts. The Ukraine examples are really commonly known, but Azerbaijan is another example, right, where they leverage drones in a very unprecedented numbers and use them in new ways for propaganda as well as strikes. in a way that enable them to combat a much larger, more advanced conventional force. And so that's kind of one of the key reasons that we think it's so important to get these innovative technologies out there.
Natasha, that innovation that we keep pinning a lot of our hopes on, the future of rules-based global order, no pressure, is a function of private sector entrepreneurialism, right? Like a lot of the reason why we're talking about many of these innovative technologies today is because they're often downstream of commercial innovations, right? That's one of the big changes of the last few decades of where defense tech comes from. What do you see in this space here that is encouraging you, that's discouraging you? Do you feel like the processes and rules set up here are making it easy for an investor like you to be able to, push forward your agenda and seize that innovation? What can we do to help?
So I'll set the scene by starting off with 2025. There's been about $40 billion deployed over 300 plus deals up until now, first 3 quarters. And if you talk to any economist on Wall Street, and I'm an economist by background, they will talk about how we are coming down in a productivity slump. So there is investor appetite. That appetite is going into deep tech. Let's talk about deep tech. The number one thesis that I have in deep tech is it requires capital. Yes, it requires talent. We have a plethora of talent. We have a ton of that here in this room, in defense, going to commercial sectors. But the number one, I think, gap between realizing that talent and that potential is archaic legislation and investor appetite for risk. Right now, since about 2020, we have seen that risk appetite shift. I'll say from my perspective, again, I came from the space world. SpaceX was the reason why there was a lot of interest initially on firms that were not affiliated with defense tech that were late stage. Late stage firms bring the late stage capital. They want that company to either go public or scale. That's the money we need right now in defense tech. SpaceX's current valuation is $400 billion. They have not told us when they are going to go public. We're estimating, depending on what the interest rates look like and what the economy looks like, 1 to 2 years. Anduril and SpaceX, by the way, is dual use. And they have done some really great legislative arbitrage to become dual use. All the investors now know that space launch is the bottleneck. Well, guess what? Because SpaceX has demonstrated value in its equity, there's a trickle-down effect where now investors are willing to take risky bets that our Space Force needs. For example, investing in infrastructure for cislunar space. You mentioned space, you mentioned data collection. The ultimate highest ground is cislunar space, the space near the moon where we have no active sensors near the Lagrange points. China and Russia are creating a center there to collect that data. Investors, because of SpaceX, because of that value creation, are willing to now invest in something that the US probably won't realize 5 to 10 years from now. That's the kind of appetite that I think is very promising. But again, this is where we need demand signals and we need policymakers to be very open and honest, including DoD, of where they see the need. That's the name of the game. Let's talk about Anduril's valuation, $40 billion. Anduril is really going to lean into this attrition-based warfare thesis, right? In order for companies that are dual use to scale, they need market access and they need to go through DCS. FMS truly is only scalable for programs of record, companies who already have programs of record. For new innovative technologies, if you're a non-program of record, there is no way, unless you are DCS, to scale within markets. And again, there's some technologies that could be commercially derived that in our current legislative scheme are deemed as defense only. That limits our ability to influence and create interoperability with these allied partners. The second reason, again, the risk appetite is there from the private capital side. What I'm not seeing enough of are the contract demand signals and long-term thinking from, I would say, people within the DoD. And there have been some desire to do FMS reform. This administration's been very forward-thinking and coming through with how can we create a shorter time. But again, I'm not seeing the demand signals for how DCS is going to improve and how that coordination between commerce, state, DoD, all of these interagency players are going to work to see the potential of that technology. And that's the only way. Not only are we going to get public exits again this year, Firefly and Voyager, both space technologies exited and went public. Great public sentiment in terms of late investors in Wall Street. So I'm excited to see what happens. But again, I think this reform is super necessary. Last thing I'll mention, why do we want to be in Asia? Everyone right now is gearing for Indo-PACOM. All of the startups that I talk to, they are thinking about how they can best support logistics in Indo-PACOM. If we are going to expand and our bottoms-up build and our addressable market is going to include Asia, we need to have a presence in Asia. And the only way we do that is if we're able to do this through DCS. And I would think this is a huge mutual benefit for allies and for the DoD to have startups be based there and create interoperable joint ventures within militaries to create these new concepts for new technologies. China's already doing this.
Very well put. And I think it's a really interesting question about DCS, direct commercial sales, being what looks like the path of least resistance here for a lot of this tech diffusion and innovation diffusion to a lot of our allies and partners. But to just foot stomp that a point you made there, Natasha, you say the risk appetite is there among the investor community and the defense tech investor community in particular for these allies and partners, both from a mission perspective, but also they're confident they can get the financial returns equipping this sort of partner-led deterrence framework?
Yes, and again, we can talk about this offline. I think because the valuations have been promising and because, for example, specifically in space launch, there's been a lot of interest in US assured access to space. There's a myriad of critical technologies, but yes, the risk appetite is there. And what you're seeing actually are people from later stage funds coming into defense because they see that defense, there's opportunity for disruption there. And again, I don't want to harp on the primes. I'm sure other people can. The primes have been late to the game, and that's why you're seeing more risk capital coming into innovation at the earlier stage.
Great, thank you. Chris, you had mentioned earlier how important AUKUS was to this story, and the legislative exemption, export exemption there, being the first in many years. And so I wanted to pose this question to the whole panel. What did we learn from that effort? And how might it apply as we think about FMS reform and direct commercial sales reform and the kind of efforts that we're talking about today?
Well, touch on some of the things my colleague said first. Bayraktar, Turkish support to Azerbaijan. Let's remember that the whole reason the Turks built Bayraktar is because we wouldn't sell them Predators. And so they innovated their way into something else that now obviously competes to some extent as well. I think it's important to note that's a breakdown in the FMS MTCR process that in policy that the US had 15, 20 years ago. And that highlights kind of a need to think differently about this. I highlight that because that's part of what AUKUS was trying to get at, and I'm focusing mostly on the Pillar 2 side, not on the Pillar 1 side to this, is that what's important here is that we don't own the crown jewels of defense technology anymore. We own a lot of them, but we don't own all of them. And if we're going to get access to the things we need to work in partnership with our allies, with other like-minded countries. And so Pillar 2 was about how do we do not just co-production, but more importantly, co-development. How do we be able to work and share technology across national boundaries? And to my colleagues' comments about being able to access foreign markets, Right now, what a lot of these companies are doing is they're just opening an office in a foreign country and then bifurcating themselves from their US counterparts so they don't share the technology across those lines. That's the stuff we have to get at in this. Again, AUKUS was an effort to say, let's take two Five Eyes countries, our closest partners. We already share incredibly sensitive technology and intelligence with them, so why can't we do that in the co-development stage on the weapons side? So I think what it highlighted is that that is not something that all of the bureaucracy supports doing. And those are part of the biggest lessons learned from this, is where those pockets of resistance are, where the challenges for the political leadership and the political will to come in over the top of that and say, this is what we need to change, this is how we need to change it. It is still a work in progress, without a doubt. You know, there are efforts and lots of papers have been written about bringing in the Japanese or the Koreans or others into this. I still think we need to get it done right first with the Brits and the Aussies. But if, again, we can demonstrate it, if we can get a couple technologies deployed through it, then I think that will bode well for a broader effort to reform the process in all of this. We are still moving far too slow in that. But again, I think it's moving in the right direction. We just need a little more speed of relevance here.
Well put. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just add a point on that, and picking up on what a few people said. I think with the AUKUS Pillar 2 exemption, it's kind of illustrative of good progress, but where there's still other challenges, and that there's a lack of clarity completely in whether companies just take the exemption, and whether that is going to be upheld. And so I think it's illustrative of the wider challenge that we heard a lot in digging into this project that we hear from companies is inconsistency, particularly for ITAR-controlled technologies for licensing or tech transfer policies, a myriad of rules that it's hard to navigate, and lack of transparency if a transfer is denied, why that happened, and what changes either a company or a country might be able to make to access the technology. And I think that is true for the way the Pillar 2 exemption has been applied in slightly different ways, but it's a common theme. And the one other piece I'd add that kind of picks up on what Natasha said about this whole issue set is when it comes to companies being willing to, investors being willing to take risk, but concerned about the concerns really come down to ITAR-controlled tech. And I think in that particular space we see with commercial tech startups, the challenge being the lack of the control list keeping pace with the state of technology. And so you have, and it's really hard, but you have technologies that maybe weren't dual use yesterday. Maybe they were just defense, but now today they do have commercial applications and they should be considered dual use. And so a key theme that we heard a lot in these conversations and we really emphasize in the report is looking at ways to update those control lists more regularly.
I have a lot of things to say on Pillar 2. I'm a big believer that we need Pillar 2. Again, if you look at the entire, like a lot of the thesis that I'm seeing come up in late stage firms on unmanned manufacturing affordable mass, right? The biggest element to this, data collection, data sharing, that is not happening with Pillar 2. Even if there are sponsors, DoD sponsors, that sign off and say, we want this exemption to happen, companies are not getting the exemption. It is very unclear who is allowed to do what, and these are our most important allies. And I can only speak on the AI side because I've talked to a bunch of companies who are working on the C2 and C4 ISR side who say, if we're gonna do any type of logistics support and planning, we need to be able to share data. That's not happening.
So I think about a couple. So I'm a software guy by nature, right? And so I think about a couple of things. So one, when we did Project Maven, we recognized that if we wanted to work with the best in breed and the best people, we had to work with people who were working for U.S. companies that did not have security clearances, and often with researchers who may or may not have been born in the United States, right? So it's amazing to me that we go through all these hoops to work with Maven, to work with people who have, like, you know, no background checks, none of this stuff. And yet, when we think about working with some of our closest allies, people who have gone through all kinds of background checks and all these kind of approval processes and things, we aren't willing to work anywhere near as closely with them as we are with some of these people that we brought in for projects like Maven, right? That's kind of crazy to me. Similar to kind of echo Natasha's point on data sharing, the pushback on data sharing is often, we might get somebody killed, sources and methods and all this stuff. But I see no correlation between the parts of the government that are willing to share information and the parts of the government that have the most sensitive information, right? Like the intel branches actually do a pretty good, and obviously there's stuff we can't share, there's stuff that needs to be close held, but like the intel branches honestly got their act together post 9/11 to do a lot of data sharing. And yet you hear from people in logistics or other places that are much less sensitive, and they're like, oh man, we can't share data. Really? Intel's sharing data? Why aren't you guys aren't sharing data? How is this proportionate, right? So to me, I think the thing that we really need to get to is sort of, I think of it as like a GovCloud for AUKUS or a GovCloud for NATO, right? Not to use the Amazon branded term, but as the best generic, term for what that would be, right? Shared cloud computing environments that would be co-operated and co-funded to really take advantage of the fact that we need a common infrastructure to really do really advanced data sharing and research. When you look at how all the big tech companies do this, their teams share these massive computing clusters, right? Like Google Search shares that with Google Relevance, shares that with AdWords, shares that with Gmail, right? And they're able to capture these massive return scales by having this co-developed infrastructure, right? And so there's really no reason why we shouldn't be doing things like that, both with our allies and partners and within the U.S. government generally.
Well put. So for our, we've talked here today about the problems we're facing, the significant points of friction between us and the upside potential here, the really interesting, fascinating deployments of innovative technologies that could really meaningfully change the strategic environment as we know it. We're going to go to audience Q&A here in a moment. We're going to have a mic round, so start thinking about what questions you might have for our illustrious panel. But to close out our formal panel portion here, I'm going to ask each of you to tell us, if you had a magic wand to wave at the defense export reform ecosystem, what would you point it at first? What are your favorite couple of items here that, that is just the most urgent bottleneck that needs to be broken down here? And then we'll come back around to the audience for questions thereafter. So Jamie, please go ahead.
I think the most critical, and I would say also unique to this conversation, is creating a formal way for the U.S. government to validate, test, and contract for non-programs of record for innovative systems that it's not buying at scale, but that allies and partners need.
I do two things. One, just the risk analysis that I've referred to, especially at the Department of Defense, and wanting to close hold things too much, and then the lack of certainty and clarity in the process itself and how things are considered.
For me, it would be creating a better communication pathway for companies who've gone through the FMS process to figure out why they haven't gotten exemptions. And then if there is a fast track for critical technologies, let industry also tell you what those critical technologies are. It should be collaborative. This is a public-private partnership, not, siloed investigations.
So I'll admit I'm less of an expert on the details of the export control system, but I do think the ability to rapidly share data. So I think that's something that, in theory, you can structure it in a way that you actually would avoid large portions of the existing system. So, for example, if it is in fact DoD-owned data, from my understanding, they actually have pretty extensive authorities to say, yes, we can share this without having to go through State Department. Whereas anything that's physical, even if it's Lockheed Martin's intellectual property and it's a part to the F-35, then essentially there's no good way to avoid that whole State Department review and things like that, right? But if it is in fact owned by a part of the government and that commander says, I think that this can be shared, I believe there's a much greater degree of discretion. So that's probably something that I would probably use a little more creatively, especially with these more digital native technologies.
Wonderful. And then to one last question for Jamie, Woman of the Hour here with our new report out today. Give us hope for the future. What is it that we should be doing here today to realize this future world of innovative tech diffusion, more capable allies, partner-led deterrence as a result of innovative technologies?
Well, I'll just say that everyone here in this room, between the group, has seen these issues from every angle. So I think the hope, thank you all again for being here, is to kind of continue the conversation together by diving deeper on a number of these issues, building out the conversation into next year. And I think, as we said, we do see a lot of energy and interest coming out of defense acquisition reform, and I think there's a lot of potential to dive more deeply in some of the issues that we're talking about that have a specific relevance to innovative tech and non-programs of record.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have a mic here in the corner. Wave it down for your most pressing questions for our illustrious panel here today. Yeah, right here in front.
Sorry, I'm going to go straight across. First of all, Glenn Farnsworth of the British Embassy. Thank you all for the panel. It's, from our side, hugely encouraging to see the conversation going on. It's something we have been working closely with you guys to try and overcome for many years. I'd like to start off on the Pillar 2 AUKUS exemption, just to emphasize for the people in the audience, it's not just Pillar 2 projects. That was a key point in all of this, was to make sure it's beyond just Pillar 2 projects. The ETL is still a problem. We work with that to try and expand that, but it has to go wider. And the reason for that is we have to get industry on board and willing to work with us as well. There may be a lack of appetite in government to take risk, but equally in industry, they have a process. They like to have a piece of paper. So there's a degree of working on both sides there. If we build something and they don't adopt it, we've wasted our time, is what we've been saying. But on that, I think from a UK perspective, the answer is usually, if not always, yes. It just takes 90 days, 180 days, an indeterminate period of time to get to there. And by that time, our Chinese competitors have gone 2, 3, 4 times around the development cycle. How do we get to that decision, which is yes, generally, faster, more predictable, in a more predictable fashion?
Before I turn to our panel here, I will note that the very patient AUKUS partners in the audience drink free at the after party. Any thoughts from our panel here?
This is the challenge. We've had these conversations before. This is an issue of constant feedback with the departments, with trying to help break that cycle of the default being no. And that is sadly going to continue to take time to be able to get this right. But again, that's everything that I've been talking about today.
I'll just add, I think, on a big piece of the recommendation in the report is addressing the culture within all of our institutions. And I think that there's a number of issues there, but it starts with how you incentivize personnel in performance reviews. There's other issues related to, and this is more challenging, but how do you manage the relationship such that you enable the technical conversations that need to have around what should this advanced capability development look like in a way that's broad, but then you also manage expectations and don't create a diplomatic fallout if the answer does end up being no. And I think that's what we hear, where a lot of the cultural bias towards no is, or what takes a long time, is working through the system. And so we have some recommendations around, and I think there's more work to be done here around how do you create space for people to feel comfortable saying yes, and saying yes more quickly within diplomatic relationships. I think that's the hardest part.
I would say DC is the land of coalition building. And again, the naval narrative has done a really great job. People have set the story for why it matters in the public communication channels. And I think for expanding the AUKUS Pillar 2 list and getting fast track, I think you need to have more industry involvement. Right now, it feels like it's a little bit siloed still, and bring investors to the table, bring investors of all sizes to the table. and let them tell you who can actually do what you need in your region. And I think not only does it become an economic development package for interoperability, it also becomes a tool and a financial incentive for companies to come to the UK or Australia.
So last thing out of it is this actually seems like an application that AI itself could be a pretty useful thing for, right? So if I have a history of approval decisions and I say this next decision looks a lot like that one, also if the US were able, the US government should have a lot more information about companies and who has Chinese ties, who's a little bit risky, right? So I think, information technology itself should be able to sort of say this one should be in the fast lane. This British company got an approval 90 days ago. We already looked them over. This thing isn't that different. In theory, that should be something that, a lot of these things probably could be waved through almost instantaneously, and then only sort of new and unusual stuff would require an actual detailed human review.
Great, thank you. Next, we're going to go back here, and then we'll do in the back with Iris.
Hi, Mira Resnick from Saronic. We are a defense tech startup. We produce autonomous boats. I am so appreciative of your focus on non-program of record, because I think that is truly one of the major obstacles. And I'm curious how you think the US government can validate technology, because partners do want to see that the US government is using that technology. But as we can see, especially this week, as we face an imminent government shutdown, US funding of a technology is not assured and can be very unpredictable. But a partner might need that technology even if the US military can't because of funding, or won't because they don't necessarily need that funding. So what is the way that the US government can validate a technology and be able to communicate that to partners without making it a program of record?
I can start with that. And thank you, Mira. Mira worked on a number of these issues and has been a really important part of this project too. So glad you're here. This is, I think, one of the most interesting and accessible opportunities for reform, because I hear ideas across the interagency that I didn't hear a couple of years ago. We include some of them in the report. I will say, as a starting point, what's not in the report but is interesting is the Senate NDAA this year would create a joint program office in OSD for non-programs of record. I think that's a great start. I think, as we all know who've worked in the bureaucracy, it's hard to have an entity in OSD that doesn't have coordinating or offices in the military services. So it's probably, I have a lot of compassion for whoever has the job of standing up that office, but it's an important start. But I think there's a couple of ways that we've seen emerge in ad hoc ways in DoD, which is leveraging more experimentation funding in military exercises and tech demonstration funding to at least show to partners, here's the capability. I think you build that out by creating a pathway that goes through all the testing and evaluation, contracting, et cetera, everything that a program of record would go through, but for an ally, paid for through an element that would be within the FMS cost, which is a construct that exists for other costs as a part of the system. That has happened through DIU inadvertently through CSOs that are for the U.S. Joint Force. I think whether or not that is best suited for DIU to take on or for a military service, one could have a conversation, but I think taking that structure and applying it to allies and partners is the way that we look at it. I just want to say one other thing on the culture piece. I do think on technology, we did talk to folks in the government about this delay problem, and I do think there is also a combination of, I know it's hard to say right now, but like additional personnel and technology that could be applied to some of the kind of delay challenges that you were talking about.
Any other additions to this one here? I think Jamie did a wonderful job with being the change we seek in the world on this very big question here. Then on our last question, before we have a moment for you all to come grill our panelists individually, here in the back, Iris.
Thank you, Harry. My name is Iris Shaw. I'm Taiwan's DPP U.S. mission. Thank you for mentioning the AUKUS and helping. It's really helpful. My question is, do you see any conversions or synergy and lessons learned as the administration continue to build up this from the last administration on Piper, the partnership for Indo-Pacific industrial resilience, in particular when we're facing the challenges of the defense industrial base, the arms sales delay, and then thinking hard on how allies and partners could help with the co-production.
I can, in terms of Taiwan doing an excellent job talking to critical technologies, I can say a lot of the companies that I've talked to have talked to your mission, either a representative here in the, in the DC area or the Bay Area or in Taiwan. So I think the collaboration I really think it is a pull scenario where the startups are pulling that type of leverage. Now, co-production and joint development is very difficult. I haven't seen that initiative from the startup side. They will still say, unless they have the capital to be able to co-produce in Taiwan, a lot of them are choosing other regional partners where they know there might be better policy towards co-production. For example, I know that Japanese partners are leveraging the JVs, and so are South Korean partners. So I think that is an area of opportunity. I think we should definitely be looking from a logistics standpoint, co-producing in Taiwan. I haven't seen the financial incentives yet from the US side for startups to be able to do that.
I would just add, it's a great question. I think there's two aspects of your question around like the economic and innovation collaboration that we hope to dive into in future projects, but I'll give you kind of the top line thoughts. I think one element is looking at co-production broadly as a part of the US approach to arms sales, because supply chain resiliency is such an important aspect of kind of a broader deterrence picture, right? You don't have, you can't deter conflict if you have a key missing part of your supply chain that can be cut off in the middle of a conflict. And so there were conversations, I think, that started through Piper, the initiative you spoke about, Iris, about how can the US approach to arms sales include co-production more systematically, and that's an important thing, I think, to build on. The other, I would say, corollary to that is the collaborative research with allies and partners, with kind of building on the AUKUS Pillar 2 model and engaging with, Singapore, Australia, Japan, the UK, all of the defense tech accelerators that have been starting up. They're like ad hoc collaborations. Some are kind of more enduring, but I think particularly on the defense accelerator side, there's also an opportunity there.
I think that on that source of optimism, we're going to call the formal program for today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you again to SCSP for being wonderful partners and co-hosting this event. Thank you to Jamie for all the wonderful work that she did on the report leading up to this effort, to Chris and Natasha for the critical efforts you were pushing forward in your respective sectors here. If you would all please join me in giving a hand to our distinguished panelists here. This has just been a tremendous event. And please come and buttonhole them and tell them what you think they should be doing in their respective fields.